Welcome back to the 6th Gear Garage. Today we are doing a lot of work on this 1980 Toyota long bed. In the last video of this truck, I cut out the rusty floor on the driver's side and replaced it with a new floor panel, along with some fabricated pieces I made for all the other rusted out areas around the floor. I wasn't going to document the passenger side floor since it was the same job. However, the rust crept all the way up the wheel well and firewall into the engine bay. And while I was already cutting so much out, I figured I might as well replace the entire rocker panel as well. Let's get that welding blanket. I'm going to use this as a guide. Pop the breaker. And I was only at 20 amps, which is actually the lowest setting this thing has. If I had a 220 outlet over here in my garage, I could go all the way up to 50 amps. After cutting out the very rusty areas, I'm using the wire wheel to see how far the rust extends up behind the undercoating. And unfortunately, the rust crept up the firewall past the top of the wheel well area, all the way into the engine bay. There's not a whole lot of room to work here on the inside, and you saw how far that rust went up through the spot welds into the engine bay. This whole panel right here is pretty bad, and if this wasn't here, I'd have a lot better access to work on this area up here. Now this inner fender here, you can see, hasn't really rusted too bad. It's mostly just the metal on the firewall, which is the inside of the cab. Now, this piece isn't just gonna be something I can drill out spot welds and remove. This is actually one piece here. It's all the inside of the cab here. So what I'm gonna do is cut this right here, drill out spot welds here, pull this whole piece off since it's pretty bad anyways. Let's go check out the parts truck. This one is by no means perfect, but it's a lot better than the one on my other one. So I'm gonna take this off and use it for the other truck. I will fabricate a new corner piece down here because that's rotted through, but the rest is pretty good, just a light surface rust. And unfortunately, this is rotted through down here, but I'm gonna keep in mind that I do have a very solid piece right here in case I do end up needing that as well. First, I remove the seam sealer with the wire wheel. Then, cut along the vertical seam. Next, I unbent the lip along the top edge and drilled out the spot welds. Then, went in the side of the seam with a chisel to finish breaking them apart. Now I have access to work on this area at the corner of the engine bay on the firewall. First, I'm removing all of the seam sealer. And then did the same in the engine bay. And chiseled apart the two panels. Well, I'm glad I'm doing this, even though I'm not liking the findings. Pretty rusty back in there. This is still looking pretty solid. This is what is mostly rusted away. You can see how thin it is. I was hoping that I'd be able just to peel this off up to like here, cut it off, and just weld in a whole new piece here, but this actually wraps up under this here, which is the bottom of the cowl. And now I realize that it wraps up under it. It's probably rolled into this main seam right here that goes all the way across the firewall. And this is something that I'd rather not mess with because there's probably 3, maybe 4 pieces of metal there rolled into one. Now I'm using the grinder to clean up the surface rust, followed by the wire wheel. I saved some time and used the Weber plasma cutter to cut this panel from the parts truck. Chiseled through some spot welds, and eventually the entire piece came free. Next, I'm cutting out the rusty wheel well section on the Ohio 1980. Now I need to trim the donor section to match what I've cut out on the blue truck. After trimming this to fit, cleaning it up, and removing paint from all the edges, I'm about ready to weld it in. Here's how it looks. Everything is clamped in place. I cut a little bit too much at the top there. I've got a little bit of gap. A little bit too much to weld shut, so I will have to cut a slim piece of metal to fill that in. Everything else though is looking pretty good. I'm going to weld this part last. I'm going to tack the outside first, and that way I can get this all nice and flush, and then bend this closer as I need to. After doing a few tack welds on each edge to get everything positioned in place and being sure that nothing moved, I welded in the floor section. This was a tough area to access and see exactly what I was welding. Notice I burned through a few times. I'm by no means a professional fabricator, just a hobbyist. And this truck is by far the biggest project I've ever taken on. But I'm excited to save it from the grave. So now that I have all of that done, now I can go to the inside and focus on the floor, which was the original plan. This one isn't as bad as the driver's side. It's solid all the way out to here, and it's solid over here too. So that's pretty good. I won't have to cut out the entire floor. I can just use a small piece of my patch panel and cut out what I need and weld it in. However, the inside is actually a lot worse. This rocker is definitely more rotted than the other side. The rot actually extends back farther, and you can see I try to grind down some clean metal, and I ground through right there. This is just pretty thin at this point, and if I'm gonna do it the right way, I should probably replace the inside panel as well as the outside because it is not much better. You can see I've rotted through right there. That's all real thin right there. You can see it's actually rusted through right there. I mean, there's no holes here yet, but I don't know how thin it is. It is very pitted. I didn't grind through, but I didn't grind down to clean metal all the way yet either. So before I even go ahead and mess with this, I think the right thing to do here is to replace the inside and the outside. And luckily, I have the donor truck for this. And if I'm going this far, I might as well replace it all the way back and eliminate this big ugly area right here. And I don't feel bad cutting this up because if you remember, this entire side of the truck was all smashed and dented in. However, the rocker panel looks like it's still straight. You can see the damage starts right about here, which is about all that I need. So this works out great. Now there is, of course, some rust. There's actually some bad spots right in here, but that's not gonna be too difficult to fabricate. That's just a small area compared to what I have going on over there. That's really nice over here. Just about rust-free with the exception of a little bit of surface rust and a tiny bit of rust around a spot weld right there. And unfortunately, both of the fender bolts broke off in there, so I'll have to get those out as well. But take a look on the inside. This still has the extra bracing that goes over the cab mount on the frame. So I think what I'm gonna do is just cut out probably about right in here somewhere. Cut this out here, cut this out, cut it right here, and just take this entire rocker panel and this front area here and bring it over to the other truck. Now that's a huge piece, and getting that lined up is gonna be tricky, but I do have this to go by, and I still can line this up with the hole on the other frame, and then I'll get me dialed in up here, and then back here I could probably just sort of eyeball it and get it to be just right. I started off with the Sawzall, but switched back to the Vever plasma cutter to cut through the floor. So before I can even start mocking this up and figuring out what parts I'm going to use on this truck, there are some really crusty parts I need to completely remove. The pitting is pretty heavy on this bracket, but it's a thicker gauge of steel, so I'm able to grind a lot out. I'm going to treat all of this with a rust converter later on. But there's a lot of very thin rusty metal that isn't even worth trying to preserve. So I'm cutting all of that off first. Now I'm marking each spot weld with a punch. Applying some oil to the spot weld drill bit helps it cut faster and extends its life. I'm saving this little corner piece to reuse later. I'm removing all existing paint from the edges that I'll be welding. Now it's time to trim the fat off this rocker panel. The top edge of the rocker is actually less rusty on the blue truck, so I'm not going to need that part from the donor truck. I'm using part of the inner rocker panel from the donor truck since my Ohio truck is completely rotted away here. And now it's time to drill out the spot welds on the bottom edge of the donor rocker panel. And finally, break any remaining areas of the spot welds with a hammer and chisel. All right, my donor panel is now free from the rest of that rusty junk over there. And here I have my original rocker panel next to my new one. And you can see, if you line them up, I've got a lot more fat to trim off of the new one before I can get it even close to fitting. But I'd rather take off not enough than too much and have to go back and fabricate new metal. So I've got to come off all the way across here a little bit. You can see this edge is a lot shorter. Now keep in mind, for the thickness of the blade as well, that's about an 1/8 inch. My next step is going to be a lot of precise measuring and drawing and cutting and trimming down over and over and over to get this thing to fit as perfect as possible. And that's a long, tedious process. Up to this point has been nothing compared to the long, repetitive measuring and trimming, measuring and trimming, test fitting over and over I'm about to do. Now check out the inside here. The Z-bar really did preserve a lot of this metal inside this rocker panel, and that's good. This really wasn't that bad. They must have poked holes in here to spray inside the rocker panel, because if you look, it looks like someone just stabbed it with something really sharp right there and right there. This panel does not have that, but it does have a little bit of surface rust inside, but that is really light. And this might actually be just some of that red Oklahoma dirt. Might not even be that rusty. Now that I'm working with just the outer skin of the rocker panel, I can trim it down more accurately. And I'm trimming the inside as well. So as I'm trying to line this up, I figured I might as well take out this old, crusty bushing from the Ohio truck and put in the one from the Oklahoma truck, which, as you can see, it still has the metal washer on top. This one was completely crusting and rotting away. So take a look at this Ohio frame. It's still pretty crusty in there where the bushing goes. Now, come look at the Oklahoma truck where I got this bushing. Look at how clean this frame is where the bushing sat. Look at that, not a speck of rust. And this is just all light surface. A Southern parts truck was definitely worth the shipping. Thank you again, Michael Burbank. I bolted on the passenger door from the donor truck to make sure the gap is even along the bottom where it meets the rocker panel. But this isn't going to work. And the original doors have no bottom edge because Ohio. So I'm using this old spare door I have. I think it's from a motorhome because it has this weird mirror that looks like somebody stick welded onto the door. Problem now is I put this on, I shut it, the handle is stuck, and regardless if it's unlocked or locked, it won't open. So now I gotta climb in here and take this panel off and see if I can figure out what's going on. All right, we're back in business. I just have to take the panel off and loop some things up inside the door. So, looking down here, in pretty good shape on the finger gauge, going from front to back. We're nice and even on both ends, so that's good. And looking down here, I was able to line this up along with the bottom just right because the spot welds are in the exact same position pretty much throughout. So I was able to get this lined up pretty much how it would have been from the factory. There is one problem though. Somehow, I'm not sure exactly how, I ended up taking too much out of here. How I had it before was perfect, and I went back and took a little bit too much out. So what I'm gonna have to do now is weld a piece of metal on the inside of this bottom piece, and then weld that in here. And then I'll have something back here to weld the body to. And if we look inside here, I have some high points on this still that I need to take down because when I push this in to get it flush to weld it, pretty good in some parts, but like right here, I gotta take this down. I've marked all these. These are just alignment marks here. I gotta take this down right here. You can see this black. And just like up front, I took a little bit too much out right here, so I'm gonna have to put a little backing plate on there to weld these two together. We're looking pretty good over here. I am gonna have to take some off the back here. And I'm also gonna cut a square out here and just weld in a new piece of metal so I don't have these holes showing. Let's just use this tool here to do a quick check on the profile, just to make sure that I'm totally not off on something like my height here, where the two pieces will meet. All right, there's my profile. And there you go. You can see that is pretty much the same. Really useful tool. I'll put a link to one of these in the description. The bottom fender bolts were rusty and snapped off in the rocker panel when I removed them from the white truck.
So now was the ideal time to drill out those and retap the holes. And then clean up some of this surface rust. Before I can treat this rocker panel with rust converter, I need to give it a good wash to remove any dirt, grease, or oils. And then use compressed air to make sure the entire surface and all crevices were dry.
Now I've got this all degreased and cleaned up, and it has been drying for a while now. Next thing I'm going to do is use a rust converter to convert any remaining surface rust here that you may see into a black zinc phosphate coating.
Following the instructions of the rust converter, I sprayed the product over any surface rust and let it sit for at least 15 minutes, applying more if the surface started to become dry.
So I need to keep this wet with the rust converter for at least 15 minutes, and you can see all the areas of surface rust have now turned into this black finish here. Some areas I think just had a lot of staining, maybe from tar or just from the red dirt they have down there, because this is not changing. But over here, look at all these chips in the paint that used to be brown from rust. They've now all been converted to black. But a lot of this is actually just staining on the white paint. I'm going to be grinding all these edges clean anyways because they're going to be welded on, so the very edge doesn't matter to me.
After 30 minutes, I rinsed the product and cleaned the rocker panel one more time. Next, I used a wire wheel to remove all paint from any edge that is going to be welded, including all of the holes for the plug welds. First, I replaced those two areas that had round holes cut in them. Then added tabs to the back side of the rocker panel where I had trimmed off too much material.
I have my repair areas done on my rocker panel. I have all my extensions welded on to cover up my gap. And now I've already cleaned up the spot welds on the back side of the rocker panel. Now I've cleaned up the spot weld areas on the cab itself. Now I'm going to paint everything with some weld-proof coating to ensure that it doesn't rust after it's welded.
I still had to do some more grinding on the extension tabs I made in order to get the rocker to fit exactly how it should. Once I was happy with the fitment, I installed the door one more time to check the gap and make sure everything was even.
Everything is in place exactly how I want it. That took a lot of time to get just right. It turns out this isn't a Mercedes. The panel gap isn't perfect to begin with, but I want to get it as best as I can along the bottom of the door. Somehow it gets a little bit larger in the middle than it does on the ends, but you know what? I can live with that. It's just an old Toyota truck. All of my reference marks are lined up. I've got the spot welds lined up along the bottom, so I'm all good there. And up here you can see the gap that I welded in the extra piece to fill. That's good now. I'm really happy with the way this is sitting. So I'm gonna get the welder and start tacking. So I've got it all welded up, and now time to grind it down.
The cardboard prevents sparks and metal dust from flying across the garage and getting everything more dirty than it already is. I used a piece of wood and then the welding blanket to block the sparks flying into the cab because the seatbelt was still attached.
So I've got these welds all ground down smooth now. These back ones around the corner here, I might have to get those a little bit better once I have the cab separated from the bed where I get some more room to work. But next thing I'm gonna do is go over them with this sanding disc And that's gonna take them down a little bit more smooth and get rid of some of these grooves. And that's it. This rocker panel has been completely replaced. All welded in, all ground down, all nice and smooth, all metal. Now this job was a little bit bigger than most because I also had the inside structure to worry about, and I did this all at once instead of separating the outer skin from the inside and doing it in separate pieces. So my next step here is doing the exact same thing that I did in the video on the other side, which is going to be rebuilding this here, rebuilding this here, and cutting a new section of floor for my panel to put in right here. And I'm gonna blast through this in time-lapse mode to save you some time because it's gonna be the exact same steps that I did over here.
This Ohio cab was a worst case scenario, needing floors, inner and outer rocker panels, wheel wells, and even a little firewall replacement. I'm no pro, but I'm happy with the results. The next step in this build is going to be removing the cab and engine from the parts truck and prepping the frame to get it looking like new again. Consider subscribing for more how-to videos and project vehicle updates here at the 6th Gear Garage. Thanks for watching.